Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another edition of Budget Magic. So, a couple of weeks ago, we ran into this crazy deck on Against Odds. Our opponent was discarding a bunch of stuff, and all of a sudden there were Gearhulks flying all over the place, and it looked super sweet. So, based on that idea, I decided to build, I guess, my take on it. So, this is still my list. I didn't just net deck this from someone else, but it's definitely influenced by the card choices that I've seen from people playing similar lists. So I don't remember the player's name on Against Odds or the other people I've ran into on Magic Online doing similar things, but credit to them for a super sweet idea. So this is my take on Madcap Gearhulk Reanimator. Basically, we're looking to cheat Gearhulks into play as often as possible, as quickly as possible, in any way possible, because Gearhulks are actually really strong, and even stronger when they're coming down every turn starting on turn 4. So as you can see, $93 in the paper world, 43 ticks on Magic Online, so not a bad price for a really fun and unique deck. A quick reminder before we break down Madcap Gearhulk Reanimator: if you haven't already, take a minute and click that subscribe button down in the corner of your screen. It's an awesome way to support the channel and the site for free. So let's talk Madcap Gearhulk Reanimator, and the foundation of this deck are the Gearhulks. We have a lot of Gearhulks, 10 in all. 4 combustibles, 3 cataclysmics, 3 noxious. So the entire idea of this deck is to just start playing Gearhulk after Gearhulk after Gearhulk and hoping that our Gearhulks will just outvalue our opponent. So one of the reasons that this plan can work is the Gearhulks are really big. Like, take combustible Gearhulk, a 6/6 first striker is a pretty big body that closes out the game quickly, and even the other Gearhulks, Cataclysmic being a 4/5 with Vigilance, Noxious Gearhulk, a 5/4 with Menace, are pretty big for their converted mana cost. So the other sweet thing about these cards is they have really good enter the battlefield abilities. So Combustible Gearhulk is our most important Gearhulk. There's a reason it's the 4 of, and that's because Combustible does everything we want in this deck. First off, we have a lot of expensive stuff. So it's not unreasonable that we're going to deal 10 damage, 12 damage to our opponent if they choose to let us mill the cards. Plus, we're reanimating stuff, so we don't really mind milling the cards anyway. That's still beneficial for us. On the other hand, if our opponent lets us draw 3, that's great too. We find more Gearhulks, we find more reanimation, we find more powerful stuff that we need. So Combustible is insane in this deck. It's just the best Gearhulk for this deck. Cataclysmic Gearhulk is kind of hit or miss. It's much more high variance than our other Gearhulks, so it's awesome in some situations. It gives us a chance to beat go-wide creature decks, just wrath away a whole bunch of stuff, leave behind a big body. There's other matchups where, against like control decks, our opponent probably doesn't have much. It's just a 4/5, so it's a little bit swingier than our other Gearhulks, but still very necessary, because in the matchups where it's good, it's really good. And then Noxious Gearhulk just snipes down any one creature and gains us a bunch of life, which can be relevant. Our deck, while we do have early game removal and stuff, we really don't start doing crazy stuff till turn 4, turn 5, somewhere in that range. So having Noxious not only kill something, but gain us some life is a pretty big and important swing. So Gearhulks are the foundation, but how are we getting these Gearhulks into play? Well, the big deal is Cathartic Reunion and Tormenting Voice, which let us stock our graveyard really quickly. On turn 2, we're just discarding, hopefully, Gearhulks from our hand, getting them in our graveyard, cycling through our deck really quickly, finding more Cathartic Reunions and Tormenting Voices to do it again. So it just helps us churn through our deck at lightning speed and get a bunch of Gearhulks in our graveyard really, really fast. Plus, along the way, we're making sure we hit our land drops, we're finding our removal spells to kill our opponent's stuff. So these are also really important. We always want one of these in our opening hand. I mean, we can keep hands without them. One of the sweet things about this style of reanimation deck is all of our stuff is castable. I mean, While 5 and 6 mana is expensive, we can certainly win games where we just cast Gearhulks, which is actually really important to our deck because it gives us a way to beat graveyard hate, which is kind of on the rise since a lot of people are using the graveyard now. So being able to just cycle through our deck, hit our land drops, and cast Gearhulks thanks to Cathartic Reunion and Tormenting Voice is a nice backup plan to have access to. As far as the reanimation, the fastest reanimation we have is Refurbish. So turn 4, get back a Gearhulk from our graveyard after discarding it on turn 2 or turn 3 to our Tormenting Voice, to our Cathartic Reunions. So just straight up Gearhulk to the battlefield, and it's pretty powerful. 4 mana is pretty cheap for reanimation in Standard, and even though it's limited to only artifacts, which definitely influences the choice of spells, that's why we're not playing any Razakast or some of the other big stuff you could reanimate. Hitting artifacts can also be an upside because it actually lets us reanimate our other reanimation spell in God-Pharaoh's Gift. So God-Pharaoh's Gift gives us repeatable reanimation and does so many cool things where we're just getting back Gearhulk after Gearhulk. They're triggering again and again. We get back a Cataclysmic to blow up some of our creatures so we have more Gearhulks in the graveyard, or Noxious Gearhulk to kill our own Combustible Gearhulk to be able to get back Combustible Gearhulk to draw some cards or stock our graveyard. It gets really out of control. So we can just cast it on turn 7, but more likely we discard it in the early game, reanimate it, and then if we have the option, we almost always just want to take God-Pharaoh's Gift first as far as reanimation, because once we get back God-Pharaoh's Gift, it's kind of like double reanimation because it triggers right away on our turn. So on our first main phase, if we refurbish God-Pharaoh's Gift, at the beginning of combat, we're getting back our Gearhulk and getting all the triggers anyway. So let's kind of target one, especially if we have some Gearhulks in our graveyard already. The other sweet thing about this deck is we have 4 Madcap Experiments, which is kind of a refurbish, but it gets cards from our library instead of our graveyard. So pretty much 4 mana, lose maybe 4 life on average, 4 or 5 life, somewhere in that range. Sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's 5. That's like the typical range, though, 3 to 5 life, I would say. And we get a random artifact from our deck. So in our deck, that means 4 things. One of our Gearhulks, we have 10 of them in total, and also our 3 God-Pharaoh's Gift. So when we cast Madcap Experiment, hopefully on turn 4, we're getting one of those cards. The downside is we can't really control what one we get. While none of those cards are bad, there's also situations where there's not great. Cataclysmic on an empty board isn't really exciting. Combustible, when our opponent has a big threat and we're behind on board, especially an evasive threat, isn't as exciting. So we can't really control that, but the value is still really strong. To be able to get a 5, 6, 7 mana threat on turn 4 is a pretty good swing. There's also some risk with the life. It doesn't happen often, but there have been games I've played with this deck where you cast Madcap Experiment, and instead of losing the typical 3 to 5 life, and the life loss is kind of minimized by Noxious Gearhulk gaining back life, so that kind of helps deal with that problem. But there's definitely times where you just get unlucky and it's 16 cards until you hit an artifact and you just kind of lose. Doesn't happen very often, but every once in a while it will happen that you lose to your own Madcap Experiment. So it's worth being aware of as you play the deck. If you are in a fragile situation or if you have other options, it might be better to shy away from it, but on turn 4 you just get so much value out of the Madcap Experiment. As far as the rest of the deck, Cut to Ribbons and Never to Return give us some sweet removal. The cool thing about these cards is they're good discard options when we don't need them. So even though the Aftermath side isn't efficient, if we're trying to choose what to discard to Cathartic Reunion, to Tormenting Voice, these are good possibilities because we get some value from them in our graveyard, and Ribbons actually wins us a decent amount of games. It just sits in the graveyard, eventually our mana gets built up, and we drain our opponent for like 6 or 7 or 8 life after getting in some Gearhulk damage. Also some cool tricks where we like mill it to Combustible Gearhulk, and then flash it back to get in the rest of the damage. So pretty sweet to use the Aftermath removal. We also have Magma Spray as our early game removal. Exiling's nice against Monument decks, Scrap Heap Scrounger decks, Zombie decks, a lot of different decks. The Exiling is relevant. And then Radiant Flames as our other sweeper besides our Cataclysmic Gearhulk. Mana base wise, a ton of dual lands, also some red-white dual lands and some basic lands. Moving to the sideboard, we have Doomfall and Transgress the Mind as discard for controlling decks. Doomfall is a pretty interesting sideboard card. It's not very efficient, But the ability to be removal for like gods and bristling hydras, and also be our expensive Thoughtseize and control matchups, makes it pretty good. A single Transgressive Mind for additional discard. Obnixilis, just card advantage in control matchups. It's a good threat to just stick and hopefully take over the game. Then we have some more removal, never to return for Planeswalker matchups. Cut to Ribbons actually kills a lot of stuff. It gets Glorybringer, it gets a lot of the Eldrazi, so it lines up pretty well with a lot of threats. Radiant Flames for more sweeping, Magma Spray and Chandra's Defeat for the mono red deck primarily. Magma Spray gets rid of Earthshaker Kenra forever. Chandra's Defeat kills pretty much anything in the red deck for just 1 mana instant speed, plus it can hit Chandra against some other decks. And then by force and release the Gremlins, give us an answer to artifacts, and that is Madcap Gearhulk Reanimator. And I think this deck is really fun. I mean, reanimating stuff is fun, playing huge threats really quickly is fun. We get cool enter the battlefield abilities with the Gearhulks, and when the deck just like gets going, it does some really powerful things. Just casting a Gearhulk every single turn. Our opponent kills it, we reanimate it, then we Madcap Experiment, get another one, eventually we God-Pharaoh's Gift, keep getting them every turn again and again and again. It's really cool, and it does really take over the game. We don't have a lot of crazy synergy. There's a few little tricks, but for the most part, I found with this deck, we just get up to like 4 mana, and then we're like, alright opponent, we're going to cast a Gearhulk for the next, let's say, 5 or 6 turns in a row. If you can beat us casting Gearhulks 5 or 6 turns in a row, then good for you, you're going to win this match. But a lot of times, they just can't do it. So even though Cataclysmic and Combustible might look a little bit janky, when you just cast them again and again, eventually it does overwhelm the opponent and just take over the game. So I think it's pretty fun and really interesting. It's cool to have a reanimation deck back in Standard, and the Gearhulks are a really good way of doing it because they work so well with Refurbish. So anyway, that's Madcap Gearhulk Reanimator, our budget magic deck for this week. Let's get to the gameplay videos. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you soon. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, take a second and click that like button down below. It's a great way to help support the channel for free. And you can find the next video in the playlist right here.